You hear the iron clink of a halter before you see her. The rope scrapes against cobblestone, damp with morning fog, as a woman is led toward the market square. Around you, the air smells of ale, manure, and frost-bitten breath. You can't tell if this is a sale or a ritual, only that everyone is watching. Before we begin, if history's darker corners fascinate you, lend this story a moment of your curiosity. Drop a like to help us reach more history lovers and tell us where in the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze us how one story from a forgotten English marketplace can echo in homes from Lahore to Lisbon, from Boston to Bucharest. Now, step closer. The crowd is gathering. The market at Smithfield was already alive when the wife arrived. Pigs squealed in their pens, cattle shifted under the whip, and men argued over oats and rent. Then came a ripple, laughter, shouts, someone clearing space near the tavern wall. A man in a mud-streaked coat stood tall, holding a rope looped around the wrist of a woman. "Gentlemen," he called out, voice cracked from ale, "here's a fine wife, sound of limb, able in all her duties. Who'll take her?" The laughter that followed was not cruel, at least not entirely. It was the laughter of men who believed this was fair play, an arrangement more honest than the courts that ignored them. Divorce in Victorian England was a luxury priced for the rich. For everyone else, misery was permanent, unless you could turn it into spectacle. The halter was no accident. In some towns it was around the neck, in others the arm or the waist, but always visible, always symbolic. It turned the wife into livestock, yes, but it also made her visible in another way. When the husband led her through the market, he was not merely selling, he was declaring before witnesses that he surrendered his claim. And in the eyes of the community, that made her free, if only barely. One eyewitness from 1832 wrote, "The woman looked neither ashamed nor afraid. She held her head high as if to say, 'I choose to be sold.'" In that crowd stood miners, washerwomen, and cobblers, people who understood that this performance was often mercy disguised as cruelty. Many of these women had chosen the halter over the drunken fists that waited at home. Some even arranged their own buyers. In Yorkshire, a wife named Mary Collinson fetched 1 shilling and a quart of beer. Her husband, drunk but cheerful, declared he'd had his fill of marriage. The man who bought her, a widower, led her away to laughter and applause. They lived together another 20 years. A strange sort of happy ending, if such a thing could exist here. The newspapers printed the sales as curiosities, half mocking, half moralizing. The Times described one event in Manchester where the crowd grew so large that police intervened. The woman, wearing a ribboned bonnet and a halter of blue rope, seemed the least distressed of the party, the article read. But behind those words hid a question too dangerous for print. What kind of society drove its poor to sell their wives like cattle, and to call it freedom? The answer was buried in law and hunger. A working man earning a few shillings a week could not afford a separation. The law of coverture made his wife his property, her wages, her body, even her children. But property, paradoxically, could also be transferred. The sale, however barbaric, created a loophole, a way to rewrite ownership without Parliament's permission. The Church despised it, the magistrates ignored it, and the poor relied on it. Imagine the sounds: the murmur of the bidders, the rustle of skirts, the creak of wood under boots slick with mud. Someone spits. Someone coughs. Someone yells, 2 shillings and a Sunday coat. The husband nods, satisfied. The crowd roars. Coins change hands. And just like that, a marriage ends. And yet, the market continued. Through the 1820s, 1840s, even into the dawn of Queen Victoria's reign, the ritual persisted like a bad dream that England refused to wake from. Clergymen condemned it. Magistrates called it illegal, but no one stopped it. The poor had made their own justice, and no law could replace the simple, terrible logic of desperation. By midday, the fog had lifted. The crowd thinned. The woman, no longer a wife, not yet anything else, walked away beside her new husband. Behind her, laughter faded into the rattle of carts and hooves. The tavern door swung shut, leaving only the faint smell of ale and smoke. For a moment, the market was quiet again, as if the earth itself had swallowed the secret whole. But England remembered. The drawings, the pamphlets, the gossip, they traveled faster than law, and somewhere another husband saw those words, "A fine wife for sale," and wondered what price his misery might fetch. The halter waits, coiled like a question no one dares to answer. The next market will open soon. The ink of the law was colder than the iron in a blacksmith's forge. It hardened into words that chained without touch, sentences that erased whole lives. When a woman said "I do," she disappeared, not into love or safety, but into ownership. It began quietly, centuries before the halters and the marketplaces. In dusty courtrooms lit by candlelight, English judges wrote the creed of possession into permanence. The doctrine was called coverture, a word that sounded almost gentle, like shelter, but it meant absorption. By marriage, declared William Blackstone in 1765, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. She could no longer own property, make contracts, or even claim her own wages. In the eyes of the law, she had ceased to exist. Outside the courts, the world echoed that silence. In the narrow streets of Manchester, women carried coal on their backs, scrubbed floors until their fingers split, and still owed their earnings to the men who spent them. Their names did not appear on deeds or ledgers. Their signatures, if they could write them at all, were worth nothing. To the state, they were extensions of a man's will, his shadow, his reflection, his property of flesh. The philosophy was simple, almost elegant in its cruelty. One household, one body, one voice. And that voice, by divine and civil decree, was male. A wife could not sue her husband. He could not be charged for taking her by force. The law recognized no violence within unity, no theft within ownership. Imagine the sound of a courtroom in 1820, the scrape of quills, the murmur of Latin phrases, the thud of a gavel. A magistrate reads a petition from a woman seeking separation. Her husband has beaten her, taken her wages, pawned her shoes. She begs for relief. The judge adjusts his spectacles and replies, "Madam, you have no standing before this court. You are one person with your husband." The record ends there. Her name vanishes into the archive. But not all vanished willingly. In the industrial towns, whispers of rebellion began to flicker like gaslight in the fog. A few women found a way to twist the law against itself, to turn their sale into salvation. If marriage made them property, then selling that property might buy them freedom. In one case from Lincolnshire, a woman named Hannah Brown arranged her own sale. Her husband, a violent brickmaker, agreed to part with her for 5 shillings. But it was Hannah who found the buyer, a kind-faced farmer who'd promised her safety. When the halter was placed around her wrist, she stood straighter than anyone expected. "I go by my own choosing," she said. The crowd cheered. The magistrate, pretending not to notice, looked away. In these transactions lay a terrible paradox. The very system that denied women autonomy also gave them one final weapon, the fiction of their own worth. A wife could not leave, but she could be sold. In that brief, shame-soaked ritual, she became visible again. The price of her humiliation was her independence. Across England, reports multiplied. Some women fetched coins, others a pint of ale, others nothing at all. In one case, a wife offered herself freely, so long as her new husband promised never to drink. He did not. Within months, she was seen again in the marketplace, halter once more around her neck. The circle of desperation was endless, and yet there was something almost defiant in it, a spark of agency smothered by centuries of submission. The law had erased these women from its ledgers, but the streets remembered them. Ballads whispered their names. Gossip preserved their choices. They were not saints or victims. They were negotiators of their own survival, bartering dignity for deliverance. By mid-century, a few voices within Parliament began to tremble with unease. John Stuart Mill wrote that marriage under coverture was the only actual slavery recognized by English law. Reformers spoke of change, but their words fell softly against the clang of factory bells and church chimes. For the working poor, the law was an abstraction. They lived by hunger, not philosophy. Picture the interior of a coal-streaked cottage near Sheffield. A woman sits by the hearth, her hands blistered, her child asleep beside her. On the table, a crumpled newspaper tells of another wife sailed 2 towns away. The article calls it vulgar and degrading, but she reads it differently. To her, it is possibility, a door creaking open, a chance, however small, to belong to no one. When reform finally came, in fragments, in whispers, it did not come for her. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 allowed wives to keep their wages, but only if they earned them independently. The law had begun to thaw, yet the centuries of silence lingered like a bruise that refused to fade. The doctrine of coverture was never dramatically overturned. It simply decayed, leaving behind ghosts in the language of law and love. Even now, in brittle letters and forgotten ledgers, one can trace its echo. A woman's name crossed out, replaced by her husband's. A contract signed by Mrs. with no first name. A record that reads only "wife sold, witnesses present." In the dim light of history's forge, you can still see the mark of that cold iron, the shape of a chain so thin, so ordinary, that for centuries no one thought to call it by its true name. And somewhere, deep in the archives, Hannah Brown's halter lies forgotten, a rope that once meant humiliation and, for one moment, freedom. The halters began to disappear long before the shame did. What had once been a spectacle of laughter and coins now hid behind closed doors, exchanged in whispers and ink. The marketplace fell silent, but England's conscience did not. Every rope left behind became a question. How much is freedom worth when you have to buy it yourself? By the late 19th century, the world was changing faster than the law could follow. Factories smoked across the Midlands, newspapers printed 1,000 new opinions a day, and in drawing rooms lit by gaslight, women began to read about themselves for the first time. Literacy was its own rebellion. A wife could finally learn that she was not alone, that somewhere others were writing the same words she dared not speak aloud. I want my life back. But the shadow of coverture lingered. Even after the first Married Women's Property Act in 1870, a wife's independence existed mostly on paper. The courts still spoke of duty and obedience, words heavy as lead, coated in piety. Divorce, though technically possible, carried ruin. The poor could not afford it, and the respectable would not survive it. Between disgrace and despair, some still chose a third path. The ancient ritual stripped of its halter, dressed now in silence. In 1883, a London newspaper recorded one of the last public sales. A man named Horace Tovey sold his wife in the market square for a single sovereign. The crowd was smaller than it once would have been. A constable watched uneasily, torn between ridicule and duty. When asked why he'd done it, Tovey shrugged. "It was cheaper than divorce," he said. The woman, her name never printed, walked away with the buyer, her face veiled. The paper called it a barbaric survival of ignorance. But ignorance had little to do with it. Poverty did, desperation did. The industrial age promised progress, but its mercy was selective. In cities, women now worked as typists, nurses, factory hands, earning their own coins for the first time. But for every woman who stepped into modernity, another still stood in the doorway of an ironworks or a tenement, waiting for a man to decide what she was worth. Freedom was not a gift, it was a negotiation. The reformers, earnest men in waistcoats, women in sensible dresses, celebrated each new law as victory. Yet even they sensed the hollowness beneath their triumph. Rights on paper could not erase the centuries etched into habit and fear. A woman who left her husband risked destitution. One who stayed risked madness. The ledger of liberty was written in invisible ink. By 1913, England stood on the edge of modernity. Yet in a village near Leeds, the old ritual stirred one last time. A woman named Annie Chapman, not the infamous one, but another, was sold for £1 and a pint of ale. It was reported in a local paper, half in disbelief, half in fascination. No law recognized it, no priest sanctioned it. Yet it happened, quietly, almost tenderly. The husband shook hands with the buyer, the wife wept softly, and the crowd, few enough to count, pretended not to look. The journalist who witnessed it wrote, "It felt like standing at the grave of an age that refused to die." He was right. The sale was not just an act of desperation, it was the ghost of a system gasping for relevance, one last echo of a world where dignity could be priced in coins. And still, the law moved slower than conscience. Even as suffragettes marched through London streets demanding the vote, even as women chained themselves to railings and broke prison windows, the deeper chains, those of custom and expectation, remained intact. The halter had become invisible, woven now from respectability, religion, and fear. When she vanished into the gray, she carried more than her shame. She carried the memory of every woman who had stood before her with a rope around her wrist and a prayer in her throat. Each sale had been a transaction, but also a testimony, a protest carved in the language of survival. Progress came, yes. By the time the First World War began, women could hold property, sign contracts, and soon cast votes. The halter was gone, the law rewritten. But freedom has its own price, and history collects interest. Beneath every victory lies a silence where someone had to lose first. And if you listen closely, somewhere between the turn of the century and the turning of the page, you can still hear it. The soft drag of rope against stone, fading into history, never quite gone.